Another topic I'd like to speak about here is that of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction comes from two Latin words. To speak the law really means authority. And there are three types of jurisdiction. There's ordinary, there's delegated, and then there's supplied. Now we have in the traditional movement today, amongst those who call themselves traditional Catholics, some people who are what we call home aloners. And just like to reassure you that these home aloners, the unfortunate thing is they do not know the principles of canon law. That's the problem. They're grabbing out this canon, this way, or whatever, just randomly, and they forget the very purpose of law. Pope Pius XII was addressing these students who are going to be studying canon law in Rome, and he says the whole purpose of canon law is the salvation of souls. That's the supreme law, the salvation of souls. And so the Church goes out of her way to make sure that her children are provided for. Now, with regard to ordinary jurisdiction, this comes from an office. So a diocesan bishop, he has ordinary jurisdiction. In fact, he's called the ordinary. If the diocesan bishop delegates to someone this or that authority to do whatever, then that is given by someone who has the office. But supplied jurisdiction, this is supplied by who? By the Church. Now, in normal times, I'm going to try to explain this very simply. In normal times, let's say, hypothetically, Father Casimir Pistorius, in normal times, he's from the Spokane Diocese, and he's going to go up to Manitoba to go fishing, which I know Father Casimir wouldn't because he doesn't like fishing because he can't catch any fish anyway. So we call that, and no disrespect, but amongst the priests we call that the Curse of Casimir. So, and I'm not going to get off into a tangent, but this would happen. There's a family up in Minnesota, and every year they take me out. This guy would take me out one day to go fishing. He could actually get a guide. I mean, they have sonar where they can tell you where the fish are. They know what the bait is. They know what the temperature of the water is. They know all these things. So it's me, or I should say, it's the guide is there, then my friend, and Father Casimir, and then myself. We are using the same poles, the same bait. I mean, we're only about 2 feet apart in this boat. I hated to say, I got another one. Because Father Casimir is just sitting there holding his pole, getting nothing. I'm not sure if there's negative vibrations coming down that pole and down the line to the bait and the fish, and we're not biting on this one. But how do you explain it? I mean, you got 3 of us. I mean, we're catching really nice walleyes. In fact, I think we caught 21 walleyes. It was nice that Father Casimir came along because we can get his limit too. So, make a long story short, we came in, and then this fella, he was, at the time, his wife was traditional Catholic, he was not. And he always wore sunglasses and, smoked a cigarette, and he's like mafia guy, But before he died, he got reconciled to the Church and was receiving the sacraments. He died of cancer. But he comes up to me and says, and he wasn't trying to be disrespectful, he says, this Casimir fella's pretty down, isn't he? He said, what we go to another lake and we get some easier ones. So we go to this other lake, and this is Minnesota, and these lakes are huge. Sometimes you can't even see across the lake. We're in the middle of this lake, and once again, Father Casimir not catching anything. But then a storm came up. Huge squall line, and this is a downpour. And he gets the motor going, and it's not going, and we're getting pushed by the wind on the other side of the lake. So I try rowing, and he gets the motor going, and we're just heading. It's a huge storm, lightning and everything. It's going to be pretty dangerous on the lake. And we're just heading back as fast as we can, and the water's splashing over. We're getting wet, soaked. I leaned over to Father Casimir and says, "How do you like fishing now, Father?" He says. So that's. I'm going to say that the title Curse of Casimir. Don't repeat that to anybody. Okay, just keep it. That's all confidential, okay? Just can't talk about that. Now, Father Casimir goes up to Manitoba. That's what we're going to talk about. And he's visiting a remote parish. And he gets there, and he's just going to visit there. He's on vacation. And he has no faculties to hear confessions. And we're talking about normal times. And let's say, hypothetically, the priest there gets violently sick. Bad flu, throwing up. He can't even get out of bed. Sunday comes, a whole long line of people for confessions. Father Casimir can't reach the ordinary, the bishop of the diocese. The pastor's sick. What does it say in moral theology? He could go inside the confessional, invoking the church supplying jurisdiction, because it's for the benefit of the faithful. Those confessions would be valid. It is not your worry when you go into confession, knock, knock, hey, Father, do you got faculties? Can I see your faculty papers? Can you read that in Latin? What did the bishop say here? It's not your business to have to worry about that. Now, in normal times, let's say hypothetically, normal times, a priest is careless, or let's say he's flippant in normal times, and he goes to visit another diocese, and he thought, I'd like to see what these people have to confess. Pastor doesn't even bother to go in there, goes into confessional, turns the light on, puts a stole on, starts hearing confessions. He doesn't have faculties, and he's just in there. People start going to confession. Those confessions would be valid, but the priest would commit a mortal sin because he's forcing the church to supply jurisdiction. The church will supply jurisdiction in a case like that by what's called common error. People assume he's a priest, he's in a confessional, lights on, he must have faculties. If there's no good reason for him to be there and there's no necessity, he commits a mortal sin. If there is a necessity, then there's no problem. Now, that we're talking about normal times. Now, in the abnormal times that we're in, it says right in moral theology, ordinaries, bishops of the diocese, pastors have an obligation to provide the sacraments for their faithful. That's even in danger of death. If someone's the pastor of a parish and someone's dying, and even if there's danger of death to the pastor, meaning, let's say the guy has some rare disease, he still needs to be there. If, let's say, there's contagion, he can't just hightail it out of there. He's the pastor, it's his office, he has to stay there. Those who are not pastors, other priests who are not pastors, in the absence of pastors, they have an obligation, not by their office, not in justice, but in charity. They have an obligation in charity to administer the sacraments, hearing confessions or whatever. And these home aloners who make such an issue about jurisdiction to the point they don't go anywhere, they have no concept, none, of what the laws of the church are for and what's their purpose. In fact, in canon law, it states that if a law becomes, because of a change in circumstances, impossible to follow, if it's impossible to follow, then it ceases to be a law. It's called intrinsic cessation. Or if it works actually against the good of the church, then it's called intrinsic cessation of law. Now, we have a very interesting case with supply jurisdiction, and that is the time of what we call the Great Western Schism. This was not a schism in the real correct sense of the word, because a schism means separation from the authority of the Pope and from the church, the body of the faithful. What we had here is we had three papal claimants to the to the papacy. And to give a long story short, there were a number of popes who were making their residence up in Avignon, and they were making many French cardinals. And the deck seemed to be stacked. Popes are Frenchmen, cardinals are French, and it was just, it was getting to be very, very annoying. St. Catherine of Siena urged the Pope, come back to Rome, which he did, and he died. After he died, the cardinals gathered together, and they elected Urban VI. Now, Urban VI, he was not a Frenchman, he was an Italian, And he, within that first month, started a campaign to reform the clergy, starting with the Cardinals. Cardinals didn't like this. All the Cardinals left him saying, hey, we were under duress. During this conclave, there was a bunch of Italians yelling outside the conclave, elect an Italian. We felt we were under pressure. We were under duress. That's not a valid election. So they ran up to Avignon, and they elected their own Pope Clement. Now, as a matter of fact, Pope Urban VI was the true Pope because they recognized him as the Pope, etc. And this idea we were under duress, if you were under duress, you should have called it right then and there, but they didn't. He was recognized as Pope for at least a month. So the Cardinals went up there in Avignon, elected their Pope. So what did Urban do? Urban had to make a new group of Cardinals. And in the meantime, Clement's making Cardinals, and Clement's appointing bishops, and Pope Urban VI appointing bishops too. After 20 years of the church being split, people from Rome, people from Avignon said, we had enough of this. We're going to remedy this situation. They went to Pisa and elected another man Pope. So we had 3 claimants, and this lasted from 1378 to 1417. It was remedied by the Council of Constance, in which they elected Martin V. Now, the important thing about Martin V is this. A couple things, and we write this in this little pamphlet. We don't have enough copies to pass out or even sell at the center, but we'll make it available. In this little pamphlet answering the questions or objections to the Sedevacantist position, one of them is the issue that if there are no cardinals today, then we can never have a pope, and so Sedevacantist position is impossible, etc. But the interesting thing is that at the Council of Constance, they, without a pope, could not make any infallible statements. The pope must, either in person or by delegate, preside over ecumenical councils. And it says right in law, if the pope dies during an ecumenical council suspended, they have to elect another pope. The problem with the Council of Constance is they had, I believe, over 18,000 clerics there, but who were the true cardinals? The ones in Rome, because Pope Urban VI died, and his cardinals elected another one, and up in Avignon, Clement died, and they elected somebody else, and the one in Pisa, there were successions here going on, because this is nearly 40 years. What they did is take all the cardinals together, but that wasn't enough. They wanted to ensure that it was balanced, and so at the Council of Constance, they basically made up their own rule. We want, according to language, delegates from each country to come, and both the cardinals remaining plus the delegates have got to elect the same person, and that was Martin V. But there is a very interesting point I'd like to read to you, and that is from this Father Timothy Zappalena. He's a Jesuit, and it's in a book on the Church of Christ. The true pope was the Roman one, that is, Urban VI and his successors. Therefore, he was able to give jurisdiction to the other bishops of the other obediences, meaning the bishops who were assigned by the Pope, the supposed claimant in Avignon, and the one in Pisa. And he says, on account of the common error of the faithful together with colored title. Now, the idea of colored title is someone has the appearance of having the position or office but really doesn't. The church will supply for that. And in these times, after the code of 1917 code, the color of title is not necessary. Common error is sufficient for the supplying of jurisdiction. But this Jesuit canon lawyer, theologian, goes on to say this. And he's saying, even if none of them were pope, not the one in Rome, not the one in Avignon, not the one in Pisa, even if none of them were pope, for the rest, if you figured that those 3 popes to be null, you ought to admit that jurisdiction is supplied, not indeed by the church, which lacks the supreme power, but by Christ himself, who would have conferred jurisdiction on each of these anti-popes as much as was necessary. Now, I started out by saying this was not a true schism in the proper sense of the word. No one was denying the papacy. They weren't saying, like, we don't believe in the popes, we don't believe in papacies, we don't believe in successors of Peter. No, they all recognized the papacy. They all professed the Catholic faith. It was a doubt of fact. Who is the Pope? And so, in this case, jurisdiction was applied to all of them. And this is the point I like to make, and that is, when it comes to this issue of jurisdiction, the sacraments that you receive from traditional priests are valid. And these people that are home aloners, they don't understand what this is all about. I'd also say, too, there is a group of some of Catholics out there, traditional Catholics, who say, well, jurisdiction is only supplied to those who were ordained before the death of Pius XII in 1958. So if you're a bishop or priest before 1958, the church is going to supply you jurisdiction, but not anybody else who came after 58. And what they're trying to say is that, well, who ordained you and by what right did they ordain you and whatever else. There's also another individual fellow from, I believe, up in Alaska. He's very much into this, that there are bishops out there that do have ordinary jurisdiction because they were nominated and consecrated under Pope Pius XII. They are smaller and smaller in number. They're dying off. They're very, very old. And so, I occasionally get a letter from someone like this saying, you should go to these bishops and submit yourself to them. And this is the point. Whereas that it's nice if they're still around, but are they traditional Catholic? Did they go along with the Novus Ordo? Are they a part of the modern church, or are they traditional? And if they are not a part of the modern church and they are traditional, why haven't we heard about them? Why haven't they made a stand? And lastly, how can they help me? Because their jurisdiction would be only limited to their diocese. Many of them are retired anyway. How can that help me? I'm not saying that we should, disregard them. It'd be nice if they would want to join ship and be a part of things and try to help out, but it's not going to help me here and now. And this other thing I'd like to share with you is that when it comes to the consecration of bishops, there were some who were saying, no, unless you have papal mandate from a pope, can't be consecrated a bishop. A friend of mine, I've met him many times, his name is Stefano Filiberto. He's from Turin, Italy. He has a doctorate in ecclesiastical history. So he has the opportunity, because of his credentials, to go into the archives of this church and the Vatican archives, and whereas maybe some average person may not, he can go into some of these places. And so he photocopied a time in which there was an interregnum, where there was no pope for like 3 years. And he photocopied all the consecrations of bishops in the Middle Ages for this 100-year span. And he particularly wanted those 3 years. And he actually lists, I believe there were 23 bishops who were consecrated without a papal mandate. There was no pope, and nevertheless, when the diocese went vacant, neighboring bishops came in, consecrated the bishop to fill that diocese. And the pope, who then was elected, I believe it was Gregory X, he said, no problem. That was all legitimate, that all was fine, etc. And in these times, there's no problem. I mean, there is no pope, so that we do the best that we can to follow the canon laws of the church. But when there's an impossibility, then we obviously think, what is the mind of the church? Another area that's